Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what is up? Welcome to the NFC free agency recap episode of the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. I hope everybody's staying safe, staying healthy out there. I'm not going to waste anybody's time talking about this damned virus. I'm just going to jump right into this football talk here and start with the defending NFC champion San Francisco 49ers out in the NFC West. They began their free agency by re-signing defensive lineman Eric Armstead, center Ben Garland, and safety Jimmy Ward. They traded away defensive lineman DeForest Buckner to the Colts for a first-round pick, so they now have 2 first-round picks. They also signed wide receiver Travis Benjamin to a 1-year deal for $2 million, got him from the Los Angeles Chargers. Their key losses so far, as the case with a lot of teams that make the Super Bowl, San Fran lost a handful of guys, most notably, to me at least, wide receiver Emmanuel Sanders. I thought he was perfect for that team. I thought he was going to end up re-signing with them, but hands up as just a half-year rental for the 49ers. They also lost a bunch of defensive lineman depth with Sheldon Day, Kerry Hyder, and Anthony Zadell all heading to new teams. So it will be interesting to see how the 49ers kind of revamp that defensive line, which last year was actually one of the best in football. It was a big contributing factor as to why they had one of the best defenses in the league, why they were able to play the kind of smash-mouth, run-first football that they were able to play was because they had a defensive line that kept them in every single game. So they're definitely going to have to retool there for sure. Going up north, up to Seattle, we're going to talk about the Seahawks here. So far, the only player that they've decided to re-sign is defensive tackle Jerron Reed. They also put a second-round tender on tight end Jacob Hollister, who was 1 yard short of getting the Seahawks the number 1 seed last year, Week 17 versus the 49ers, if you remember that game. Seattle brought in 2 tackles, Brendan Shell from the Jets, and Cedric Obuawe from Jacksonville. They brought in center B.J. Finley from Pittsburgh, so they got 3 new offensive linemen to focus on the run, which they've done very well over the past few years. They also gave 1-year deals to tight end Greg Olsen and wide receiver Philip Dorsett. On the defensive side of the ball, Seattle traded a 5th-round pick to the Redskins for cornerback Quinton Dunbar, and they signed defensive end Benson Mayowa. Quentin Jefferson of Buffalo. Seattle's pass rush is going to be something to monitor because they lost defensive end Quentin Jefferson to Buffalo, and they have also yet to make an offer to free agent defensive end Jadeveon Clowney or Ziggy Ansah, which if you had told me 5 years ago that these 2 dudes would be on the same team, I'd be completely and utterly terrified if I was an offensive coordinator. But they just weren't as dominant of a pass rushing tandem as you'd think they'd be. There's a whole slew of guys that have not signed yet that played meaningful snaps for the Seahawks last year. Linebacker Michael Kendricks, defensive back Sakeem King, McKeel Thorpe, Cedric Thompson. Then from the offensive side of the ball, Jerron Brown, Mike Upati, CJ Prosise are all still available. So the Seahawks have a lot of spots to fill at multiple layers of the defense. Seems like their offensive line is going to be just as good or if not better with all the additions that they made. But let's not kid ourselves here. It's all about keeping Russell Wilson safe, keeping him upright, because you can pretty much give him anybody at wide receiver and he's going to make it work. But with the pair of tight ends that they're going to have and DK Metcalf going into his second year, I think they're sky's the limit for Seattle, as it always is. Looking at the LA Rams, almost every move that the Rams have made so far this offseason have been at the line of scrimmage. They re-signed offensive lineman Andrew Whitworth and gave Austin Blythe a 1-year deal. They signed edge rusher Leonard Floyd and defensive tackle Sean Robinson. Then after a deal fell through with the Ravens, defensive tackle Michael Brockers re-signed for another 3 years with the Rams. Their key losses, they lost a pair of linebackers in free agency with Dante Flower Jr. going to Atlanta and Corey Littleton going to the Raiders. They also lost infamous cornerback Nikhil Roby-Coleman to Philadelphia, the dude who got away with that horrible pass interference call against the Saints 2 years ago in the NFC Championship. But the most notable losses for LA has got to be star running back Todd Gurley and Greg the Leg Zuerlein, a.k.a. Legatron. And it seems like the Rams have been trying to trade away Brandon Cooks all offseason. So the Rams offense could look very different next year. If you remember at the end of last year, we saw them using a lot more tight ends than we had ever seen them use. They were one of the teams that pretty much used the 11 personnel almost exclusively. It was almost every play they had that 11 personnel out there. And it seems like this year it's going to change quite a lot. All right, and then finally in the NFC West, got the Arizona Cardinals. The biggest move for Arizona was obviously acquiring DeAndre Hopkins and a 4th-round pick from the Texans for David Johnson and a 2020 second-round pick plus a 2021 4th-round pick. Adding a player like DeAndre Hopkins is always a great thing, but to also get out of David Johnson's contract and essentially only give up a second-round pick to do it, that to me is an A++++. The NFL Network might have to redo some of their top 10 best trades episode after this, because if DeAndre Hopkins is healthy and he plays well, I think this could be the biggest steal in a long time. Arizona then put the transition tag on Kenyon Drake, solidifying him as an RB1 for this upcoming season. They re-signed Hall of Famer Larry Fitzgerald to another 1-year deal for $11 million, not too shabby, and also re-signed offensive lineman Marcus Gilbert and Max Garcia. Like many other teams, they used free agency to try and rebuild a horrible defense by bringing in defensive tackles Jordan Phillips and Trayvon Cooley. They signed 2 linebackers in Devondre Campbell and Devon Kennard. Their key losses, really the only significant loss for them was wide receiver Pharoh Cooper, which really won't make all that much difference considering they're going to roll out there with D-Hop at the 1, Christian Kirk outside at the 2, and then Fitzgerald on the inside. I think they're probably going to roll with 3 wide receiver sets almost exclusively as well, with Kenyon Drake coming out of the backfield running routes as well. So that's going to be a fun offensive to watch with their quarterback going into his second year, and that head coach and giving him legit players to use in his scheme that got him a job in the NFL. So, all right, moving on to the NFC South, we got the New Orleans Saints. They started by re-signing Drew Brees and offensive lineman Andrews Pete. They lost Teddy Bridgewater to Carolina, but they put a first-round tender on Taysom Hill. So they clearly are looking at Taysom Hill as Drew Brees' eventual replacement. The Saints lost safety Von Bell to Cincinnati, but they signed safety Malcolm Jenkins, so that to me is an upgrade. They continued to add to the secondary by re-signing cornerbacks, P.J. Williams and Justin Hardy. They signed safety DJ Swearinger. Then the Saints finally addressed their number 2 wide receiver spot by, like I mentioned earlier, giving a 2-year deal to Emmanuel Sanders. I think this Saints did some good things, but I love Emmanuel Sanders, and I think that's the move that's really going to put them over the top. This is a team that's been to the second or third round of the NFC Championship or of the NFC playoffs for the past 2 years in a row. This is probably Drew Brees' last season, so they go out and they give him a legitimate number 2 wide receiver, so it's not just Kamara or Michael Thomas every single play. I think it's really going to help out everybody down there. Looking at the Atlanta Falcons, the Falcons decided to move on from running back Devontae Freeman, and they signed Todd Gurley, which is going to get a lot of pub. But the move I'm most excited about for the Falcons was the acquisition Jesus, I got to work on my notes, man. I can't read. The acquisition of tight end Hayden Hurst for a second-round pick. They didn't want to pay Austin Hooper, who took a 4-year deal with the Browns, and they also signed wide receiver Laquan Treadwell. So the Atlanta offense will look quite different next season. The defensive line took a couple hits as well. They lost Vic Beasley, Adrian Claiborne, and Devondre Campbell, but they added Dante Fowler Jr. and Tyler Davison. They also lost longtime Falcon defensive back Desmond Trufant. I'm excited to see what this offense can do and see what Calvin Ridley can do, if he can take that next step and become a legitimate number 2 wide receiver. But either way, I think Hayden Hurst is going to fill the shoes of Austin Hooper just fine. I think he may even be better than Austin Hooper. I think he can help out in more ways. So it's going to be fun to see what that Atlanta team can do. Midway through last season, there was a lot of talks about their head coach getting fired, and Arthur Blank, their owner, came out and said, "No, we're sticking with him. He's going to have at least another year." So they're looking to capitalize on that confidence that he had in their head coach and go out there and play well next year. So next is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which, if you haven't heard, biggest free agent signing in years belongs to the Buccaneers, with them signing Tom Brady to a 2-year deal. The Bucs used their franchise tag on edge rusher Shaquille Barrett, who led the league in sacks last year. Going through doing this, I realized a lot of teams that did use their franchise tag, they used them on edge rushers. Seems to be the position that you want to take advantage of with that franchise tag. The Bucs D-line was one of the best in the league last year, and they wanted to keep it that way, so they re-signed defensive tackle Ndamukong Suh, edge rusher Jason Pierre-Paul. They continued with the defense. They signed cornerback Ryan Smith, and they added linebacker Kevin Minter. They also lost wide receiver Brashad Perriman in free agency, but I'm willing to bet that we see a hell of a lot more 2 tight end sets from the Buccaneers this year compared to last year. They still have Cam Brate, who I think restructured his deal. I couldn't find any details on that, but I'm pretty sure I heard that he restructured. Obviously, he wants to play with Tom Brady. And O.J. Howard, somebody that they drafted, I think, in the first round a couple years ago, and everybody's just been kind of sitting around waiting for him to realize his talent. So they both should have plenty of opportunities to make plays with Brady at QB. Running back Ronald Jones, however, he is going to have to step up his pass protection and his pass catching if he wants to have any real playing time with the Buccaneers. I mean, you're just not going to play with Tom Brady if you can't pick up pass rushers and blitzers, and if you can't catch the ball, because you have to be able to do it all to be able to sit behind Tom Brady. And last but not least, in the NFC South, we got the Carolina Panthers. With a new head coach in Matt Rule, the Panthers are completely turning over this team. Former first overall pick Cam Newton was cut, and he still is yet to sign with another team. I have a feeling it's going to be a while until he does sign. They traded away Kyle Allen, who started the majority of their games at QB last year, to the Redskins for a 5th-round pick. Pretty amazing that they were able to get a 5th-rounder for Kyle Allen. They couldn't get anything for Cam Newton. Starting with the offense, they signed Teddy Bridgewater and XFL standout quarterback P.J. Walker. If you want to go back and listen to my XFL recap episode 2 weeks ago, I did a little comparison between P.J. Walker's career stats in college and in the XFL, albeit only 5 games, compared to Teddy Bridgewater's career in the NFL and his last year's season. And P.J. Walker looked, at least the numbers say, he's got a pretty good shot to go out there and win that job. He started under Matt Rule at Temple, so there's some familiarity there, obviously. They let go of Greg Olsen, and they added a depth tight end in Seth Duval. They lost guard Greg Van Rotten to the New York Jets and right tackle Darrell Williams to the Buffalo Bills, but they signed guard John Miller, and they traded guard Trey Turner to the Los Angeles Chargers for left tackle Russell Okung. So some guys leave, some guys come in on the offensive line. Don't know really if there's much to make of that. But then they brought in a trio of free agent wide receivers, Robbie Anderson, Pharaoh Cooper, and Seth Roberts. Obviously, Robbie Anderson's the guy who gets the most money, and he's probably going to get the most pub out of those 3. But this defense could be the worst This could be worse this year than it was last year, which is really saying something. The biggest loss is former Rookie of the Year in 2013, Defensive Player of the Year, Luke Kuechly, who retired last season. They lost cornerback James Bradbury to the Giants and safety Eric Reed. But the defensive line got decimated by free agency. Defensive tackles Gerald McCoy and Dontari Poe both left to Dallas. Bruce Irving went back to Seattle, and Vernon Butler and Mario Addison both went to the Bills. So I don't know who is going to play along the defensive line for the Panthers this year. I don't know if they're just going to, sign a bunch of free agent undrafted guys, or if they're just going to spend all their draft picks on defensive line. But they definitely got to do something there because they lost a lot of good players. I'm not feeling great about the outlook for DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel, to be completely honest, with 2 new QBs and 3 new wide receivers in town. But I'm excited to see P.J. Walker get another shot in the NFL. Like I said, if you've been listening to this podcast, I was following the XFL pretty close, and I think he can win that Panther job, and I think it'd be a lot of fun to see a guy from the XFL actually starting in the NFL. All right, we got the NFC East, the Dallas Cowboys. They keep the big three together by using their franchise tag on Dak Prescott. They re-signed Amari Cooper to a big 5-year, $100 million deal. Tight end Jason Witten leaves for the Raiders, so they re-signed Blake Jarwin, who's in line to, get all those tight end targets. Offensive lineman Travis Frederick retired with that rare disease he has, so the Cowboys brought in interior offensive lineman Joe Looney. I had to do a double take when I saw this, but the Cowboys have signed 2 kickers to go into camp and compete, Greg Zuerlein and Kai Forbath. The defense will have some serious turnover with Byron Jones, Robert Quinn, and Jeff Heath all leaving to go to other teams. They signed corner Anthony Brown, safeties HaHa Clinton Dix, and Darian Thompson. Like I said, defensive tackles Gerald McCoy and Dontari Poe come over from Carolina. And they re-signed longtime linebacker Sean Lee, who last year, 2 years ago, they had probably the best pair of inside linebackers when you look at Smith and, of course, I'm forgetting his name now. This is what happens when you go off the cusp and you don't read from your notes. But they had 2, Vander Leitenesh, that was the guy. So they had 2 really good linebackers, and I thought for sure Sean Lee was going to be gone, but they re-signed him. So they obviously value his leadership, and with Vander Esch having the health issues that he's had, Sean Lee played a decent amount of snaps last year. So one last thing, they decided to take a chance on pass rusher Aldon Smith, who hasn't played football in 5 years, with such a huge percentage of their cap dedicated to Zeke, Dak, and Amari. You Cowboy fans should probably get used to seeing these super cheap, big upside deals like the Aldon Smith deal. They're going to have to look for needles in the haystack with so much of their money going towards those 3 guys. Next up, the Philadelphia Eagles. Besides the wide receiver group, the Eagles' secondary last year had a lot of issues, and their 2 best defensive backs both left in free agency. Malcolm Jenkins going to New Orleans, Ronald Darby going to Washington. Because of that, they signed 4 defensive backs, Rodney McLeod, Jalen Mills, Will Parks, and Nikhil Roby-Coleman. And they traded a 3rd and a 5th-round pick to Detroit for Darius Slay. So they got 5 new defensive backs coming in. Hopefully that can solidify that secondary and make the defense a lot better than what it was last year, at least in the secondary. They also lost defensive tackle Timmy Jernigan to Houston, so they signed Javon Hargrave from Pittsburgh. I was surprised that they didn't address the wide receiver position at all, especially after Nelson Aguilar left for the Raiders. Running back Jordan Howard also left. He went down to Miami, setting up Miles Sanders for the lead running back role, which is a good thing. And the Eagles are locked and loaded with 8 picks in the draft this year. They're the only team in the NFC East with a returning head coach. So Philly looks to be like they're in pretty good shape this season. Depending on what happens in the draft, I think they're probably the favorite to win the East, to be honest. Looking at the Giants, so their offseason started with them putting the franchise tag on defensive lineman Leonard Williams, who they traded a pair of draft picks for in the middle of last season, which was kind of a head-scratcher for a lot of people. The Giants are going to have a fleet of tight ends going into this year. They re-signed Eric Tomlinson, and they signed Levine Toilolu, and so those two guys to go with Evan Ingram, Rhett Ellison, and Caden Smith, who all played at least 30% of the snaps last year for the Giants. They re-signed wide receiver Corey Coleman, and they brought in a veteran running back Dion Lewis to probably take some of that passing workload off of Saquon Barkley. They spent a lot of their money on defense, signing defensive backs James Bradbury, Nate Eber, and a bunch of linebackers like Blake Martinez, Kyle Fackrell, and David Mayo. I think the Giants are set at almost every position besides the offensive-defensive lines, and I expect them to kind of hit those position groups really hard in this year's draft. Their offensive line was significantly below average last year, and they lost starting center and right tackle from last year. So it was a bad offensive line that they now have to fill in spots for as well. So that's going to be the task for them this draft. And finally, in the East, you got the Washington Redskins. The Redskins under new head coach Ron Rivera. They've been extremely active in free agency, signing the franchise tag to guard Brendan Sheriff and signing 16 players as of right now. I think that's the most so far this season, or this year. This offseason. Almost every position on offense has some turnover, starting at QB with Colt McCoy and Case Keenum both left. The team traded a fifth-round pick, like I said, to Carolina for Kyle Allen to presumably compete with Dwayne Haskins. At running back, they move on from Chris Thompson and Wendell Smallwood, but they signed Peyton Barber and J.D. McKissick to go with Darius Geis. They also picked up the team option on the $2 million option on Adrian Peterson. So it looks like I'm going to be avoiding the Washington Redskin backfield. As much as I love Darius Geis, I don't see how you're going to be able to get a guy that's going to have 15, 16 carries every week in this crew of 4 running backs. You don't go out and sign two free agent running backs just to have them sit at the end of the bench. At wide receiver, Cody Lattimore replaces Paul Richardson, and at tight end, they finally say goodbye to Jordan Reed and his 500 concussions, and Vernon Davis. They sail off into the sunset while Richard Rodgers and Logan Thomas join the team. On defense, cornerback Josh Norman leaves for Buffalo, and the team allows 5 other defensive backs to walk in free agency while they sign cornerbacks Kendall Fuller and Ronald Darby and free safety Sean Davis. So that defense is going to look completely different. A lot of new faces on that team, and we'll see if Dwayne Haskins really is the answer for them at QB. And finally, to wrap up the NFC free agency episode here, we got the NFC North, starting with the Green Bay Packers. Very typical of the Green Bay Packers. They didn't do much in free agency. They only signed 4 players while they lost 6 starters from last year. 3 linebackers all went out the door, with Blake Martinez and Kyle Fackrell both going to the Giants. B.J. Goodson leaves to go to Cleveland. They bring in linebacker Christian Kirksey to fill one of those holes at linebacker, and they signed tackle Rick Wagner. They've signed wide receiver Devin Funchess, and they re-signed tight end Mercedes Lewis to replace Jimmy Graham and Geronimo Allison. So I really thought we'd see the Packers be a little more aggressive this year with Rodgers another year older, but you know, they do the Green Bay thing. They just sit back, which has to be frustrating for Packer fans and for Aaron Rodgers. You know, in that the XFL recap episode, I was talking about a couple wide receivers that I really think Green Bay should give an opportunity to, but as of today, Wednesday, what's today? The 9th of April. None of the other XFL offensive players, at least, have signed besides the 2 quarterbacks. Moving up to Minnesota, so the Vikings set themselves up with 5 picks in the first 3 rounds of this year's draft after the trade of wide receiver Stephon Diggs to the Buffalo Bills for a boatload of picks. They used the franchise tag on safety Anthony Harris, and they put a second-round tender on linebacker Eric Wilson. They re-signed their kicker Dan Bailey and running backs Amir Abdul and C.J. Ham, who's actually a fullback. But they give a 1-year deal to wide receiver Tajay Sharp. So I don't know if that's going to be their 1-year replacement for Stephon Diggs, or if they're going to, go after one of the many wide receivers that are going to be available in this draft with one of the many draft picks that they have. But we'll wait and see. I doubt that Tajay Sharp's going to come in and all of a sudden demand anywhere near the kind of target share that Stephon Diggs had. But like a whole lot of other teams, the defense lost a lot this offseason with both Trey Waynes and Xavier Rhodes, both starting cornerbacks from last year, leaving in free agency. They also lost another 3 defensive backs, so I think we'll see the Vikings use a couple of those picks on defensive back in this year's draft as well. Playing with Zimmerman up there in Minnesota, if you're going to be a cornerback in his system, you have to be able to tackle. So I'm gonna look for them to go after one of the more aggressive, high tackle graded cornerbacks in the draft. Looking at the Chicago Bears, most notably for the Bears is the trade of Nick Foles for a 4th-round pick to come in and compete with the starting quarterback spot with former first-round pick Mitch Trubisky. Besides the Brady signing, I think this could be the most significant quarterback move, with Foles being so familiar with that system and that coaching staff in Chicago. They re-signed Danny Trevathan and Deion Bush, and they gave a 1-year deal to cornerback Artie Burns. Puzzling to me, they gave almost $40 million guaranteed dollars to edge rusher Robert Quinn and tight end Jimmy Graham. This is a make-or-break year for Mitch Trubisky. I think if he does win the job coming out of camp, he's going to be on a very short leash. That team probably gets crap every single day about how they drafted him over not only Deshaun Watson, but also Patrick Mahomes. So they got a lot of proving to do with Mitchell Trubisky. And last but not least, we got the Detroit Lions. They have been by far the most active team in free agency in the NFC North, at least. They either signed or re-signed or traded for 15 different players, 3 players from New England, where head coach Matt Patricia cut his teeth for a couple of years, and another 4 players from opposing NFC North teams. So I don't know if that's a strategy or just coincidence, but they definitely poached a couple of players from their division rivals. They re-signed safety Miles Killebrew and tackle O'Day Abouchier. They traded a 5th-round pick for defensive back Duron Harmon and a 7th-round pick, and they also traded away cornerback Darius Slay for a 3rd and a 5th round picks. So essentially, they traded Darius Slay they traded Darius Slay for Duron Harmon, and they got 3 picks out of it. So, or 2 picks, because the 5th round picks are kind of swaps. So yeah, they traded Darius Slay for Duron Harmon, and they got a 3rd and a 7th round pick out of it. Not a bad deal, if you ask me, especially for a team that is looking to, fill some holes and get some youth in there for sure. The Lions lost outside linebacker Devon Kennard to Arizona, defensive tackle Sean Robinson to the Rams, and cornerback Rashawn Melvin to Jacksonville. And it seems like they're gonna let defensive tackle Damian Snacks Harrison walk in free agency. They haven't re-signed him, and from everything I've read, they haven't made him an offer either. So, but they've pretty much signed an entirely new starting defense. So, defensive tackles Nick Williams and Danny Shelton, linebackers Jamie Collins, Reggie Ragland, and Elijah Lee. 5 new defensive backs: Desmond Trufant, Tony McRae, Darryl Roberts, Duron Harmon, and Jaron Curse. On offense, they signed a pair of wide receivers in Geronimo Allison and Jeremy Davis. Plus, they bring in guard Big V. Let me see if I can say this name here. Halapule Vaitai. Somebody can hit me up and let me know how I did there. Matt Patricia was supposed to be this defensive genius, but in his last 3 years as Detroit's head coach, the Lions' defense has not been very good. They haven't had a winning season under him, so this is going to be a big year for him. We'll see if these defensive moves can make any kind of difference for them. they got a lot of pretty good teams up there in the NFC North, so that defense is definitely going to have to shape it up. So that is going to do it for the NFC free agency episode of the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you check us out next week. We're going to start diving into some draft preview stuff. We're going to look at every division, look at all 4 teams in the division, and check out team needs and try and figure out what teams should or will do in the draft according to what they did in free agency and so on. So thanks again for tuning in. Check us out next week. Make sure you check us out. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin' or Stickin' is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin' or Stickin' is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin' or Stickin' Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.